Hello everyone. In this presentation, we're going to be going over the sonnet tradition in early modern England, specifically in the 16th century. We'll be covering the influences of the Italian poet Petrarch and Sir Thomas Wyatt and Sir Edmund Spencer as they established the sonnet tradition. So let's get started. First, we have to go back a bit. In the 14th century, an Italian poet by the name of Francesco Petrarch established what later became known as the sonnet tradition. Now, his sonnets focused mostly on unrequited love for Laura, whose true identity remains unknown, and some scholars actually think that Laura is a figment of Petrarch's imagination. In other words, she was just an object of obsession for him, or an image that he used in order to express his artistic and political ideas. Some important Petrarchan tropes that we need to keep in mind as we study the sonnet tradition in England a couple hundred years later is that one trope is the love for an idealized lady, often visualized as a hunt, where the poet is the hunter and the lover is the deer. For instance, notice the pun on deer and deer. It is also part of the sonnet tradition that these sonnets are not just about love. In fact, many of them are used or use love as a cover for political subtext. In other words, they would attempt to criticize or praise politicians and rulers through this kind of love poetry. A couple hundred years later, English poets like Sir Thomas Wyatt and Sir Edmund Spencer used Petrarch to bolster their own credibility as members of the royal court and as artists. Sir Thomas Wyatt, born in 1503 and died in 1542, was a member of Henry VIII's court. In fact, he was actually suspected to have been in love with Henry VIII's second wife, Anne Boleyn. The rumors of their supposed adultery ended up being one of the charges against Anne Boleyn that led to her being beheaded. In fact, Sir Thomas Wyatt was also imprisoned at the same time that Boleyn was executed, and some believe that he actually witnessed the execution from his cell. Poems like Whoso lists to hunt and Who list his wealth and ease retain are considered to be reactions to Wyatt's experiences with royal authority, specifically to the corruption and abuses of power that he witnessed. Many of Wyatt's poems are translations or transformations of Petrarch's poems, so it helps to read them side by side. And now, let's discuss some common tropes of early modern sonnets in England. Like the Italian versions, the English sonnets typically focused on the tragedy of unrequited, youthful, or immature love. These poems are not meant to be the end of love. They're meant to be signals of, let's say, uncontrolled passion. So when, for example, in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, early in the play, when Romeo is expressing extreme, passionate kind of love, and the other characters are making fun of him, they're making fun of him for being essentially an immature dope. Also in these sonnets, you oftentimes experience a cold, unfeeling woman who is usually the speaker's love object. And the woman is usually associated with images of ice and of freezing. The speaker, on the other hand, whose fiery passion for the love object is typically on full display, is often associated with fire or heat. One particular poetic technique, which is pretty interesting, is called the blazon. A blazon is the description of the love object that focuses on the individual parts of her body. So, for example, you might see a poet who declaims about the beauty of his beloved's skin, her breasts, her eyes, her lips, all of those. And of course, they'll focus on those individual body parts. In fact, it's kind of like a catalog of body parts within the poem. We also see, too, something that's also pretty interesting, and that is a reversal of the gender power dynamic. Typically, as is the case with Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, when he actually could behead her for even the suspicion of adultery and incest. Within the poems themselves, however, we see a reversal where we see the man being submissive and the woman being dominant. Now, some critics argue that the speaker is attempting to assert dominance by controlling the poetic image of the woman, while other scholars argue that the speaker experiences pleasure in adopting the submissive role in the poem, that suffering and writing about suffering is the mark of a true poet. Now, each sonnet presents and develops a problem that the poet is experiencing, and as the stanzas advance, we oftentimes see a quatrain or 4 lines of poetry that advances or complicates that problem. Sometimes the poet offers answers, sometimes they don't, sometimes it is just left unanswered or left complicated. Now, a couple of tips for reading early modern poetry. First off, read period to period. Now, students can oftentimes trip over the language and the line breaks in poetry, and so it's helpful to remember that these poets write in complete sentences. So read the poem from one period to the next, or one end punctuation mark to the next. So, for example, you might see a colon or a semicolon. Essentially, find the complete sentence. Now, the grammar in these lines may appear odd, not just because they're older, or they're using an older style of English grammar, but also because the writers themselves are attempting to follow a specific poetic meter, like iambic pentameter. And so sometimes it helps to rearrange the words in the sentence so that they make grammatical sense. Essentially, what you really want to do is look for the sentence's main idea. And to help with that, it really helps to locate the sentence's subject and verb. It also helps to read the poems out loud. These poems were meant to be heard, not read. And so in fact, many sonneteers would refer to their poems as songs. And so what you're listening for is the musicality or the music of the language that's being displayed within these poems. And so they're meant to be heard, not necessarily read. As an example of how reading a poem out loud or listening to it can help with understanding, let me go ahead and read a couple of poems for you. The first is going to be Whoso Lists to Hunt by Sir Thomas Wyatt. The later is going to be Sonnet 67 from Sir Edmund Spencer, which I'll read after I introduce Spencer. So first, let's stick with Wyatt. Whoso lists to hunt, I know where there is an ind. But as for me, alas, I may no more. The vain travail hath wearied me so sore, I am of them that farthest cometh behind. Yet may I by no means my wearied mind draw from the deer, but as she fleeth afore, fainting, I follow. I leave off, therefore, sithens in a net I seek to hold the wind. Who lists or hunts, I put him out of doubt, as well as I may spend his time in vain. And graven with diamonds in letters plain, there is written her fair neck round about. Noli me tangere, for Caesar's I am, and wild for to hold, though I seem tame. Sir Edmund Spencer, who lived between 1552 and 1599, is considered one of the most revered poets of his day. In fact, he was even a member of Elizabeth I's court. Spencer wanted to produce a great national literature to rival that of the ancient Italians and Greeks, and he wanted it to be, in particularly, English. In fact, one of his unfinished epics, or one of his unfinished projects, is called The Faerie Queene, which is a celebration of Elizabeth I and her magnificence. As sonnet sequences go, he wrote 2. The first, Amoretti, and the second, Epithalamion. Now, Amoretti is essentially supposed to be the traditional sonnet sequence where you have a poet who is madly in love with a woman. In this case, Spencer is in love with a woman by the name of Elizabeth. That's not Elizabeth I, that's a different Elizabeth. And Epithalamion is essentially a celebration of marriage. In fact, Edmund Spencer is unique among early modern sonneteers in that he actually married the beloved of his sonnets. And now here's Sonnet 67 from Amoretti. Please note that Spencer is also using the trope of the hunt within this poem, and yet he uses it very differently from what Wyatt does in his earlier poem. Like as a huntsman after wary chase, seeing the game from him escaped away, sits down to rest him in some shady place, with panting hounds beguiled of their prey. So after long pursuit and vain essay, when I all weary had the chase forsook, the gentle deer returned the self-same way, thinking to quench her thirst at the next brook. There she beholding me with her milder look, sought not to fly, but fearless still did bide, till I in hand her yet half trembling took, and with her own good will her firmly tied. Strange thing, meseemed, to see a beast so wild, so goodly one, with her own will beguiled. Now, notice how in the earlier poem, everyone is tired of the chase, and in fact, whenever they do find the deer, they can't hunt the deer because the deer belongs to essentially the king or Caesar. However, in this one, while the poet is also wary of chasing the deer, he actually uses a different technique to try and woo or capture the deer, and that is actually resting or not seeming like they're wanting to chase. And while even though this may seem like a much nicer way of winning the deer, remember that this is still a hunt, and that when there's a problematic nature of envisioning romance or courtship as a hunt, because eventually the hunt ends in death. And so that presents some problems with the way that men are viewing, in particular, women and courtship at the time period. Thank you for watching, and please let me know if you have any questions.